Yeah, I thought I'd discuss some evaluation again of one of my favourite topics, which, yeah, is psychopathy. I mean, as I said, I've been diagnosed with autism, and I think um, autistics can have a tendency to fixate on a special, specific interest. Add the fact that I've got ADHD, that enhances that fixation further. But essentially, is I'd watched a an evaluation of Jeffrey Dahmer from a criminal psychologist who had worked with his case. And what I found fascinating is that his assessment was that Jeffrey's motivation to have sex with dead bodies and to engage in gay relationships, despite him saying that he wasn't gay, was because of a lack of skill set in intimacy. And basically, as he had been engaging in fantasy about having those intimate relationships for many years, and that grew and grew and grew to the point where he killed people and acted out those fantasies. Now, I think that assessment is interesting because there's been disputes over Jeffrey Dahmer's diagnosis. You know, some professionals suggested that he had borderline personality disorder. When administered the psychopathy checklist, I think he scored a 38 first, and then, or I might be wrong, but he passed. He passed the threshold for psychopathy, and it is commonly assumed that Jeffrey Dahmer was a psychopath. Now, one of the things I've been exploring when understanding such personalities, and through my own interest to communicate the psychology, something I've been trying to communicate is that psychopaths can have vulnerabilities, in a sense, and deficits in emotion. And then there are exacerbated capacities for... Yeah, I just had to fix the light. Exacerbated capacities for fantasy and pursuing dopamine and stimulation. I think one of the things that sets apart high-functioning psychos from low-functioning psychos is that high-functioning psychos can blend into society. Not only do they tend to have a better understanding of how emotions work, they can manage their impulses. Whereas a low-functioning psycho, I assume Jeffrey Dahmer, can't manage that impulse. There's this assumption that all psychos are corporate CEOs, billionaires, and that can happen, but what's not commonly recognised is that psychopathy can present as awkward, in some ways can present as autistic. It's my assessment that psychopaths can be prone to depression and anxiety. If think about it, if you... The definition of psychopathy is having cognitive empathy rather than emotional empathy in a felt sense. It's also been understood that they have an empathy switch, and with stimulation, whether that be substances, sex, or intellectual engagement, they can switch on that ability to feel true emotional empathy. So there is a capacity to have empathy, it's just that most of the time it's switched off. But if you have a deficit in emotional empathy, you use cognitive empathy. But that is something that you have to intellectually work out. You have to learn how emotions work in yourself and other people. Now, if you haven't learned these things, that can obviously give you anxiety. Because you will be aware that in certain situations, you do not blend in. And in that way, again, this assumption that all psychopaths are master manipulators. Some of them maybe have that capacity, but some of them aren't that skilled in manipulation. And that, for me, can contribute to the urges and desire for dopamine, which can manifest in sex or violence or substance use. Because the individual, given that they don't have the skill set to engage in relationships, they can't manufacture a personality, and in some ways it leads them to have no sense of self. And I think anyone, regardless of whether you're a psycho or not, who can't present and assert themselves as an individual with an identity, you are going to be driven towards your base desires and pursue fantasies for power, for status, for sex, for validation at times. And I think that is a reason why some psychopaths pass a threshold where the fantasy of being notorious as a serial killer, it gives them a sense of purpose and an identity. Now, what I think is interesting... my dad came in the caravan, so I had to cut it, but we'll keep going. What I think is interesting is that I think psychopathy is complex, and there are many angles of assessing it. For example, in one sense, it's a disorder, it's a problem, a deficit. There's also a movement to suggest that it's an extreme form of neurodivergency, given that it's a difference in the wiring of the brain, which is born. So is autism, so is ADHD. And there's also some research to suggest that it's an evolutionary advantage or adaptation in certain environments. And you see, when I look at the case of Ed Kemper was particularly interesting because as he identified, because he had a great capacity to self-reflect, through his upbringing, he developed some fantasies around killing women. And he couldn't manage his urges, and ultimately he killed people. But his desire to initially connect with women, and the reason why he would engage in picking up women in his car, was to learn. Because he recognized that he had no concept of how to engage intimately or romantically with a woman. There was an emotional deficit. And he said he had anxiety and he was petrified. Now, I understand the reasons not to be overly empathic towards psychos and serial killers. They can do terrible things. But in order to properly evaluate what is going on, I think you need to remove the sensationalism and stereotyping of that condition. And you need to overcome your immediate emotional reaction towards their dangerous capacity. In some situations, having a logical, cognitive understanding of empathy and being able to detach yourself from emotional empathy can be a big advantage. But the capacity, particularly in low functioners, to not manage impulse and develop extreme fantasies, along with their deficits in creating emotional intimacy, is it a hidden disability? And that's what's interesting is I think it's not. There's tremendous capacity for a skill set in some ways, but equally it could be labelled as a disability. So, yeah.